The Cadillac pulled off Route 66 just before dusk, kicking up dust that caught the last amber light like a ghost trailing behind. The Red Arrow Motor Lodge sat alone on a desolate stretch between Glen Rio and the New Mexico border, its weathered facade the color of old blood mixed with rust. The neon sign, once bright red with an arrow pointing skyward, flickered now in patterns that made no sense. On for 3 seconds, off for 7, on again like a dying heartbeat. The motel had been built in 1952, the kind of place that once attracted families with children, young couples on their way to California, traveling salesmen with money in their pockets and hope in their eyes. Now it was different. Now it attracted people like her. Miranda pulled the car around to the back of the main office, where the manager's assistant, a woman named Dolores with eyes that asked no questions, worked the evening shift. The woman didn't look up from her magazine when Miranda entered, just pushed a registration card across the desk and accepted the cash. $40 for 3 nights. No name necessary. No one asked for passports in places like this, not in 1989. Not in the dying years of Route 66 when the interstate had already stolen most of the traffic and left behind only the forgotten and the desperate. Room 12 was at the far end of the L-shaped building, its door facing the open desert. The key was heavy and old, made of brass that had turned green with age. The lock opened with a sound like a sigh. The room was clean enough, cleaned by someone recently, though the air still held a staleness that suggested it had been sealed for years. The walls were covered in paper that had once been patterned with small flowers. Now the pattern faded into abstract browns and greys, like something had been bleached out of it. A double bed with a floral spread that matched the wallpaper. A small bathroom with a shower. A television from maybe 1975, its screen dark and blank. On the nightstand, a lamp with a shade yellowed like old teeth. Miranda sat on the edge of the bed and felt the mattress sink under her weight, felt the ancient springs compress slowly, reluctantly, as if they remembered how many other bodies had lain here over the decades and resented having to accommodate one more. She was 42 years old, though most men guessed her at 50. Life had added years to her face, not kindly, not gently, but with the deliberate cruelty of someone carving away at stone. She had been born in Laredo, Texas, raised by a mother who cleaned houses for families twice as wealthy as themselves. Married at 19 to a man who drank beer and watched television. Divorced at 25, alone by 32, and a prostitute since 35 when the divorce settlement ran out, and the jobs disappeared and the money stopped arriving from anywhere at all. She had bought room 12 3 days ago, purchased it outright from the motel's owner, an aging man named Frank, who had let the business decline to the point where he would have sold his own mother if anyone had bothered to make an offer. The room cost $18,000, nearly all the money Miranda had saved over 17 years of work. For $18,000, it became hers. The deed was filed at the county courthouse in Glen Rio. She owned a room in a dying motel on a forgotten highway in Texas, far from anyone who had ever known her, far from any place she had ever belonged. She had also purchased the room for a reason. 3 weeks earlier, a woman named Consuela had come to her apartment in Odessa, where Miranda worked from Tuesday through Friday. Consuela was younger, maybe 30, with the haunted look of someone who had also spent too long in the business, but had managed to keep a piece of her soul intact somehow, though Miranda could never understand how. They were not friends, exactly. In their world, friendship was a luxury no one could afford, but Consuela trusted her enough to tell her a story. "My grandmother came here in 1951, Consuela had said, sitting on Miranda's bed with a cup of coffee in her hands. She was 17. She came with a man named Raphael, who promised to marry her and take her to Los Angeles, where they would have a restaurant together, where she could cook and he would manage the money. The two of them stopped at this motel on Route 66, the Red Arrow, she remembered the sign, the red arrow pointing up like it was telling them where to go to find their dreams. Consuela paused, sipping the coffee though it was too hot. She got pregnant the next night. Raphael left in the morning without her, just left her there with a note that said he would send money, that he had to settle some business in California first, but he would be back for her. She waited 2 weeks. Then she realized he was never coming back. "So she came home?" Miranda had asked. "No," Consuela said. "Worse. The motel manager, a man named Henryson, he told her she could stay if she worked for him. He said she could clean rooms, cook for guests, work in the office. But after a few weeks the work shifted. He said he had money problems, said he could give her cash if she would do special services for certain guests. She was pregnant, scared, alone. She said yes. "Your grandmother," Miranda said quietly. "She was like us," Consuela finished. "But back then, it was different, more dangerous. The men knew they could do anything because there was no one to stop them, no police who cared, no society that would listen. She stayed in that motel for 8 months. She bore my uncle there in the manager's quarters with no doctor, just an old woman from town who knew about herbs and prayers." "What happened to her?" "She escaped," Consuela said. "A trucker, a decent man," she said. "He gave her a ride to Amarillo and left her money for a bus ticket. She used it to get to Houston, where she had a distant cousin. But she left everything in that room. A suitcase with her clothes, a journal where she had written everything that happened to her, her son's birth certificate. She was so traumatized, so broken, that she just wanted to get away and never think about it again." "And the room?" Miranda had asked. "I've been researching," Consuela said. "The motel changed hands several times. In 1968, it was bought by a man named Douglas Harley, who ran it until 1978. Then it was abandoned for years. Then, in 1985, it was bought by Frank, the current owner. But the rooms were never renovated during any of that time. They just gradually fell apart. Walls were patched but never painted. Furniture was added but never removed. My grandmother's room, room 12, it was boarded up for a while in the 1980s. Then Frank unboarded it." "Why are you telling me this?" Miranda asked, though she already suspected. "Because I want you to buy it," Consuela said. "I want you to go to that room and find what she left behind. It's been almost 40 years. If anything of hers is still there, still hidden somewhere, I need to know. I need to bring her story home. She died last year, you know. She never talked about it, never told anyone except me. And only near the end, when she was so tired she couldn't keep it secret anymore. But it destroyed her. All those years, it destroyed her. I want her to be remembered as more than a name on a missing person report. I want her to be remembered as a person who suffered and survived." "It could be nothing," Miranda said. 40 years is a long time. The room could have been cleaned, repainted." "I checked," Consuela interrupted. "I drove out there last month and looked through the office window. Room 12 is exactly as it was. The wallpaper is peeling. The paint is chipped. No one has disturbed it because no one cares about a forgotten motel on a forgotten stretch of Route 66 in the middle of nowhere." And so Miranda had bought room 12. She had come here to find the ghost of another woman's pain, to excavate the remnants of a life that had been buried but never forgotten. Not completely, not by the granddaughter who carried the weight of it like a stone in her chest. The television did not work. Miranda did not try to make it work. She lay on the bed and listened to the wind outside, which was a sound she knew well, the sound of emptiness and distance. The desert wind of West Texas, carrying the smell of sage and dust, and the memory of things that had died a long time ago. Tomorrow she would begin to look. Tonight she would rest, gathering her strength for the excavation that lay ahead. Chapter 2. The walls remember. The first day brought nothing but dust and disappointment. Miranda searched the room methodically, knowing that a journal and a suitcase could not simply vanish after 40 years. They had to be somewhere, had to be hidden, had to exist in some form, even if diminished to ash and fragments. She moved the bed away from the wall and found only dust, a few coins so old they were unidentifiable, a bobby pin the color of rust. She opened every cabinet in the bathroom. She looked behind the toilet. She pressed on every wall panel, listening for hollow sounds, but the walls were solid, indifferent, keeping their secrets. By evening she had found nothing, and doubt began to creep into her mind like water through a crack in adobe. What if Consuela's memory was faulty? What if the motel had been renovated after all, and the remnants of her grandmother's life had been thrown away? What if no one had ever hidden anything in room 12, and the whole story was just grief warping itself into hope? She sat on the bed as the sun set and watched the light change through the small window. Red first, then orange, then purple. Then the complete darkness that only the desert could provide, where there were no streetlights, no cars passing on the highway anymore since most of the traffic had migrated to I-40, no light pollution to dim the stars. She fell asleep that way, fully clothed, and woke before dawn with that peculiar clarity that sometimes comes after deep sleep. When the mind is still half dreaming but the body is alert. She lay in the darkness and listened to the motel around her, the creaking of wood as the building settled, the wind against the walls, the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner of the room, a sound so familiar it was almost comforting. And then she heard something else, a sound from inside the wall itself, a kind of soft scratching, as if something small, a rat perhaps or a mouse, was moving through the spaces between the inner and outer walls. The sound came from behind the headboard of the bed. Miranda got up and pushed the bed further away from the wall until it was several feet distant. She put her ear against the faded wallpaper and listened. The scratching came again, brief, intermittent, as if whatever was making the sound was moving slowly, deliberately, not frantically as an animal would move. She found a nail in the bathroom drawer and began to scrape at the wallpaper, pulling away the layers of flowers and fading design. The paper came away in strips, revealing the plaster underneath, and beneath that something else. A thin gap in the plaster, just barely visible, running horizontally along the wall about 3 feet up from the baseboard. Miranda worked carefully, using the nail as a tool, scraping away more plaster, widening the crack until she could see that it was not a crack, but a seam, a deliberate separation between two sections of wall. Someone had cut through the plaster and sealed it back up again, sealed it with spackling compound that had hardened over decades but was still soft enough to be removed if you were patient. She worked for 2 hours, scraping and pulling away the plaster in small pieces, revealing a rectangular hole in the wall, maybe 18 inches wide and 10 inches tall, perfectly proportioned and deliberately hidden. The space was dark, too dark to see into. She turned on the bathroom light and used its reflection to peer into the hole, but whatever was inside was too far back, shrouded in the deep shadow within the wall itself. She reached in slowly, carefully, thinking of snakes and spiders and all the dangers that could hide in dark spaces. Her fingers touched something papery, something soft, something that fell apart at her touch like it was made of tissue. She drew her hand back, and it held what appeared to be the remains of cloth, possibly a coat or blanket, decomposed almost entirely into fibers and dust. Beneath it, something harder. She reached again and found a small metal box, a lockbox of the sort that might hold important documents or jewelry. It was smaller than she expected, maybe 6 inches wide, 5 inches tall, an inch deep. The metal was corroded but intact. The lock was frozen, rusted solid, but the seams of the box were loose enough that she could carefully pry it open with the nail, working the metal with patient force, listening to the screech of rust against metal, feeling the resistance of time itself. The lid came free. Inside, wrapped in what had once been silk but was now something between cloth and ash, were documents. A birth certificate, still legible, dated August 15, 1951, for a boy named Miguel Carlos Fernandez, born to Maria Elena Fernandez, mother, and Rafael Santillan, father. The paper was yellowed but intact. A journal, its leather cover cracked and flaking but recognizable as a real journal, with pages that had survived better than Miranda would have expected because they were pressed tightly together inside their binding. She opened it carefully, knowing that every movement risked shattering pages that had become brittle with age. The writing was in Spanish, in a careful hand that must have been Maria Elena's, the words of a young woman, educated enough to write well, documenting her own descent into despair with a clarity that broke Miranda's heart. June 3, 1951. We have arrived at the Red Arrow Motor Lodge. Rafael says we will stay just 1 night before continuing to Los Angeles. The room is clean, and the bed is comfortable. I am happy. I have never been so happy. I am going to be married and have a family and a home of my own. I am going to cook, and my husband will manage the business. I am going to be free. The next entry was dated June 5th. Rafael has left me. He left in the morning while I was still sleeping. There is a note saying he had to go ahead to Los Angeles to prepare for our new life. But I know this is a lie. I know that he never intended to return. I am pregnant. I can feel it in my body already. The change, the certainty. I am alone. I am 17 years old, and I am alone in a motel room in the middle of nowhere, and I am pregnant with the child of a man who did not love me enough to say goodbye to my face. The entries continued, documenting the slow transformation of hope into devastation. The discovery of her pregnancy, confirmed by a local doctor who told her she was 2 months along. The manager's offer of work in exchange for room and board. The first client, a man whose name she never recorded, but whose violence she described in careful detail, the way he hurt her, the blood, the shame. The second client. The third. The others whose details blur together in the journal until they become not individual people but a single, faceless assault that repeated itself across weeks and months. But there were also moments of grace, scattered throughout like flowers growing in concrete. A cook who worked at the diner across the highway brought her sandwiches. A nurse came to check on her regularly, bringing prenatal vitamins and advice, asking no payment. A trucker brought her books from a library in the next town. People, even in those days, even on forgotten roads, recognized suffering when they saw it and did small things to help. Small gestures that were not redemptive, but at least testified that someone had noticed her pain. The final entry was dated March 30th, 1952, nearly a year after she arrived. I've decided to leave. I cannot stay here anymore. My son is 7 months old. I have named him Miguel, after my grandfather. The manager says I cannot take him, that Miguel is his property now, that I was paid for the birth and the child is part of the motel's inventory, but I will not accept this. I will take my son, and I will leave, and I will not look back. A trucker named David has agreed to give us a ride. He is a good man. He tells me that I am brave. I do not feel brave. I feel hollow. But I will take my son, and I will survive, and I will make sure that something good comes from this nightmare. I will make sure my son knows he was loved, even in the darkness. I am leaving this journal and my son's birth certificate here, hidden where only someone searching could find them. Perhaps someday someone will find them and know that we were here, that we mattered, that what happened to me was not just something to be forgotten. Miranda sat on the floor of room 12 and wept. She did not understand, at first, the full magnitude of what she had discovered. She did not immediately grasp that what lay in her hands was testimony to a crime that had never been prosecuted, evidence of exploitation and human trafficking and rape and slavery happening not in some distant country or distant century, but here, in America, in the 1950s, in a motel that still stood on a highway that still existed, run by people who had never faced justice for what they had done. But gradually, as she read and reread the journal, as she looked at the birth certificate and the fragments of Maria Elena's life, understanding grew. This was not just a tragic story. This was a crime, and it was one of thousands of women in those days, forgotten now, whose names were lost, whose stories were erased, whose exploitation was normalized and accepted and forgotten because there was no one to tell their story, no one to bear witness. Consuela's grandmother had escaped. She had fled to Houston with her son, had somehow built a life, had survived. But that survival came at a cost. Years of silence, of carrying the weight of what had happened, of trying to forget while remembering every moment. The survival itself was a kind of wound. That night, Miranda sat in the darkness with the journal in her hands and made a decision. She had bought this room to help Consuela find her history, but now she understood that the history was larger than she had imagined. The room itself was a crime scene. The walls themselves held testimony. She needed to know what else they held. Chapter 3. The Silence Beneath the Silence. The next morning, Miranda began to search the rest of the room with new understanding of what she was looking for. If a previous tenant had hidden her most precious possessions in the wall behind the headboard, what else might be hidden? What other secrets might the room contain? She found tools at the small convenience store in Glen Rio, a hammer, a chisel, say a pry bar, and returned to room 12 with the intention of tearing apart the walls, methodically, section by section, until she had exposed everything that had been hidden or sealed away. But as she worked, hammer in hand, poised to strike the first blow, she noticed something. The baseboard at the foot of the bed was slightly loose, its nails corroded and weakened by time. She pried it away and found gaps in the flooring beneath. Gaps wide enough that something could be pushed through and hidden beneath the foundation. She borrowed a flashlight from Dolores at the front desk, asked no questions, offered no explanations, and lay on her stomach with her head beneath the bed, shining the light down into the darkness below the room. At first, she saw only dust, the accumulated sediment of decades, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness and the angle of the light changed, she began to make out shapes. A shoe, old and rotted, a piece of cloth, something that might have been a bottle, its glass clouded with time, and further back, where the light barely reached, something larger, a suitcase. She worked her way underneath the bed, moving cautiously on her back, pushing with her feet against the frame, inching backward until she could grasp the suitcase. It was heavier than she expected, and as she pulled it toward her, dust fell onto her face, coating her mouth and eyes with the sediment of years. The suitcase was old, made of actual leather now dried and cracking, with brass hinges and a broken latch. It was the kind of luggage that people traveled with in the 1940s and 1950s, the sort that would hold someone's entire life. Miranda pulled it out from under the bed and into the light. Inside, wrapped in newspaper from 1951, were clothes, dresses and stockings and undergarments that had survived the decades in the darkness and relative dryness beneath the foundation. And beneath the clothes, photographs, 7 photographs in black and white, taken with a small handheld camera, showing a young woman who could only be Maria Elena. In one photo, she stands in front of the Red Arrow Motor Lodge, her hand on the arrow sign, smiling at the camera with a naivete that breaks Miranda's heart, because she knows what that smile will cost. In another, she stands next to a man who must be Raphael, handsome, dark-eyed, confident, the kind of man who knows exactly what lies will sound like truth. In a third, she is heavily pregnant, her hand on her belly, her smile gone now, replaced with something that looks like resignation. The remaining photographs show no people, just the motel, the highway, the desert, documentary images of a place that doesn't seem to understand what is happening within its walls. At the bottom of the suitcase, beneath everything else, was a letter, written in English in a careful, educated hand that was not Maria Elena's. The envelope was addressed to whom it may concern, and the letter inside was dated March 29, 1952. I'm writing this to document what I have witnessed at the Red Arrow Motor Lodge over the past 6 months. I am the county nurse, responsible for health inspections of businesses in this region. I've been coming to the motel regularly to monitor the health of a young woman named Maria Elena Fernandez, who has been kept here against her will by the manager, a man named Henry Harmon Henryson. Ms. Fernandez is 17 years old. She arrived at this motel in June of 1951 in the company of a man who abandoned her. Henryson has since held her in conditions that constitute slavery. She works without pay, in exchange for food and shelter. She has been forced to engage in sexual relations with paying customers. She is currently 7 months pregnant as a result of these forced relations. There is no medical care. There is no legal protection. I have reported these conditions to the local police department 3 times. Each time I have been told that there is nothing to be done, that the motel is private property, that the woman has agreed to be here. These statements are false. The woman is a prisoner. The conditions she is kept in are criminal. I am writing this letter as a witness and as a medical professional. If anything happens to Ms. Fernandez or her child, if she disappears or dies or vanishes into the silence that seems to protect men like Henryson, I want it known that this was not an accident, not fate, not the natural consequence of her circumstances. This was a crime, committed in daylight, witnessed by people who had the power to stop it but chose not to, because the victim was poor, because she was a woman, because she was Mexican, because no one cared. My name is Patricia Grace Underwood. I live in Glen Rio, Texas. If this letter survives, I ask that someone read it and understand that we failed this woman. We failed her completely. The letter was signed and dated. Patricia Grace Underwood, March 29, 1952. Miranda sat holding the letter and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, what she was looking at. She was holding testimony. She was holding evidence of a crime that had occurred nearly 40 years ago, a crime that had left no trace in official records, because official records had failed to document it. The nurse had tried to report it and had been ignored. The police had done nothing. The system had protected the perpetrator and abandoned the victim. And now, by accident or grace, the evidence had survived. The room had kept its secrets. The walls had preserved testimony. The past had refused to be completely erased. Miranda photographed everything with a small camera she had brought. The journal, the photographs, the birth certificate, the letter from the nurse. She documented the hole in the wall, the corroded lockbox, the space beneath the bed. She made copies of each document at the Kinko's in Glen Rio. She called Consuela and told her what she had found. "I want to bring everything to the sheriff," Miranda said. "I want to file a complaint. I know it's been 40 years. I know the people involved are probably dead. But the record needs to exist. Your grandmother's story needs to be documented. What happened to her needs to be acknowledged." "No," Consuela said quietly. "Don't do that." "What?" Miranda was shocked. She had expected gratitude, vindication, a sense that finally, after all these years, the truth would be told. "I appreciate what you found," Consuela said. "I appreciate it more than I can express. But I need to talk to my grandmother first. She's dying. The doctors give her maybe 6 months. I need to tell her that we've found her story. I need to let her decide what happens next. Maybe she will want to go to the police. Maybe she will want it all to remain private. But it has to be her choice. After all these years, after everything that was taken from her, she deserves to be the one who decides what happens to her own truth." Miranda understood. She agreed. She would wait. She would keep the documents safe. She would hold the story in trust until Consuela's grandmother was ready to decide what to do with it. Chapter 4. The Weight of Remembering. 7 weeks later, Consuela called her again. "She's gone," Consuela said, and Miranda could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the profound weariness of grief. "She died last Tuesday. I was there. She was very peaceful at the end." "I'm so sorry," Miranda said. "A week before she died," Consuela continued, "I told her what you found. I showed her the photographs, the journal. I read her the entries she had written, and she cried. I think she cried for the first time in 40 years, and when she was done crying, she said something I will never forget." "What did she say?" "She said, 'I survived because someone was kind to me. I survived because there were people who noticed what was happening and tried to help, even when they couldn't stop it. Now at the end of my life, I want other people to know what happened to me. I want people to know that it was real, that it happened, that I wasn't crazy or exaggerating. I want my son to know the full truth about his birth and his mother's suffering. I want it written down somewhere, documented, impossible to deny. I want my silence to be broken." So you want to go to the police?" Miranda asked. "No," Consuela said. She didn't want that. She said the police had their chance and they failed. She didn't want to chase justice through courts and systems that had already shown they didn't care about women like her. Instead, she asked me to find someone who could tell the story. A writer, a documentarian, someone who could make it matter in a different way. Someone who could make sure people understood not just that it happened, but why it matters that it happened, why the silence around it is a form of violence, why her survival against all odds is a form of heroism. Miranda said nothing at first. She understood what Consuela was asking, what she was offering, the responsibility of bearing witness, of transforming private pain into public testimony, of making sure that Maria Elena Fernandez's story could not be forgotten. "I know someone," Miranda said finally. "I know someone who might be able to help." She called a journalist named Thomas Garrett, someone she had met years ago, a man who specialized in forgotten histories and untold stories. She told him about the motel, about the room, about the documents and photographs, and the testimony that had been sealed in walls and buried beneath foundations for nearly 4 decades. She asked him if he would be interested in writing about it. 2 months later, Thomas Garrett's article appeared in a regional newspaper called the High Plains Journal. a publication that focused on stories of rural Texas. The headline read, "Hidden in the Walls, the Forgotten Story of Maria Elena Fernandez and the Red Arrow Motor Lodge." The article detailed the exploitation, the isolation, the crime that had been allowed to persist, the nurse who had tried to report it and been ignored, the survival against impossible odds. It named Henry Harmon Henryson, who had died in 1967. It noted that other women had likely suffered similarly at the motel, but that their stories were lost. It quoted from Maria Elena's journal. It provided the photograph of her standing in front of the motel sign, young and hopeful, unaware of what awaited her. The article was picked up by larger newspapers. It was shared on television stations. Within a week, dozens of women had come forward with their own stories of exploitation at Route 66 motels, many of them also immigrants, many of them also young, many of them also victimized by managers and owners who knew they could do so with impunity. Historians began to research more thoroughly the history of labor and sexual exploitation on Route 66. They discovered that what had happened at the Red Arrow was not unique. It was systematic, widespread, a normalized part of the economy in those days. Women, particularly poor women, immigrant women, women without family or connections, had been trafficked, exploited, and forgotten with a consistency that suggested not aberration but structure, not crime but business as usual. Maria Elena's son, Miguel, gave interviews talking about discovering, at the age of 40, that his birth had been purchased, that his conception had been coerced, that his mother's survival had come at a cost of years of trauma. He spoke about forgiving his father, not because Raphael deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger accomplished nothing. He spoke about loving his mother, about her strength, about the way she had never allowed her suffering to diminish her capacity for kindness. He spoke about his own life, about the ways that his mother's experiences had shaped him, about the importance of acknowledging history, even when that history is painful. Miranda kept room 12 at the Red Arrow Motor Lodge. She did not live there permanently. She returned to her work in Odessa, to her apartment, to the life she had built for herself. But she maintained the room. She kept it empty and clean. She placed the documents, the journal, the photographs, the birth certificate, the letter from Patricia Grace Underwood, in a protective case and kept them displayed on a shelf. She opened the room to anyone who wanted to visit, who wanted to see the place where the story had unfolded, who wanted to understand what had been hidden and why it had been important that it be revealed. People began to make pilgrimages to Room 12. Descendants of women who had been victimized at similar motels came to see the space where testimony had been preserved. Historians came to research. Writers came to understand. The room became a kind of memorial, a monument not to suffering, but to survival, to the refusal to let history be completely erased. A year after the article appeared, the state of Texas officially declared the Red Arrow Motor Lodge a historical site of significance related to women's history. The designation came with funding for restoration, for documentation, for preservation. The motel began to be restored to its condition in the 1950s, not as a museum of nostalgia, but as a museum of accountability. Patricia Grace Underwood, the nurse, was found to have kept detailed records of her visits and her observations. Her descendants donated these records to the County Historical Society, where they became primary sources for understanding the conditions at the motel and the systemic failures that allowed exploitation to continue. But the most important testimony remained the documents that had been hidden in the wall. Maria Elena had sealed her truth in darkness, trusting that someday someone would find it and understand that her suffering had mattered, that she had mattered, that her silence should not be permanent. And eventually, decades later, someone had found it. On the anniversary of the article's publication, Miranda stood in room 12 and looked at the restored wall, which had been carefully preserved to show the hidden compartment and its contents. She thought about all the rooms, in all the forgotten motels along Route 66, rooms that still held secrets, rooms whose walls still remembered things that had never been told, histories that were waiting, patient, eternal, for someone to find them and bring them into the light. She thought about Consuela, who had brought her a photograph of her grandmother, Maria Elena, taken in Houston years later when her hair had turned grey, but her eyes had regained something of their original light. She thought about Miguel, who had written his own book about his mother's experience and his journey to understand his own identity. She thought about Thomas Garrett, the journalist, who had won awards for his reporting, but said that the greatest reward was knowing he had given voice to someone whose voice had been stolen. She thought about all the other women, the ones whose stories were still hidden, whose documents were still buried, whose walls still kept secrets that the world had not yet heard. And she made a commitment to herself. She would not leave this room. She would tend to it. She would keep it as a space where the past could be honored, where suffering could be acknowledged without being excused, where survival could be celebrated without being minimized. She would make Room 12 a memorial to Maria Elena, to Consuela's grandmother, to all the forgotten women whose stories had been sealed in walls and hidden beneath floorboards. The Red Arrow Motor Lodge would no longer be a place of exploitation. It would become a place of testimony. It would become a place of memory. It would become a place where silence was broken, where the past refused to stay buried, where the dignity of ordinary people, the dignity that society had tried to deny them, was finally, definitively restored. Outside, the desert wind still blew across Route 66, still carried the dust of forgotten stories, still sang the song of emptiness and distance that marked the American highways. But inside Room 12, in the space where a wall had been broken open and truth had been revealed, there was something different. There was the sound of remembering. There was the sound of voices that had been silenced for decades, finally being heard. There was the sound of redemption, not the easy redemption of forgiveness without accountability, but the harder, truer redemption of acknowledgement, of bearing witness, of refusing to let suffering be forgotten or erased. The prostitute who had bought a room in an old motel had discovered not a ghost, not a curse, not something from another time, but something more real and more powerful. The undeniable humanity of people who had been treated as disposable, the enduring strength of truth, and the possibility that even in the darkest places, silence could be broken and memory could be restored.